Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Metzia daf Kuf Yud Bet, another very interesting daf, very relevant also. And right, anyone who has a business or who has workers who works for a company can relate to this, which is basically most of us can relate to this. Really, a lot of these issues that are coming up. I want to just remind everybody, or maybe I even haven't yet mentioned it in class, but the Shiur registration is up. So please register for the Shiur. You can find it on the homepage. If you get our links, then you should have received a link by mail, by WhatsApp. And we have a great Shiur program. Dr. Alana Stein-Hain is speaking about the ethical floor and the ethical ceiling. We have one of our learners bringing her professional insights. So great Shiur lineup, and we look forward to seeing you there next Wednesday. Okay, Wednesday the 26th, we'll finish the Masechet. That means, by the way, there's no class on Wednesday morning. Actually, it's a very short daf, which is great. So the Shiur will have time for the other shiurim, without being rushed. It's just about 15 lines of Gemara. So we'll finish the daf, and then we'll finish the Masechet together. So no regular class on Wednesday morning. Okay, let's get started. We were in the middle of this ping pong, and if you want to go back, you can look back at the study guide from yesterday, which helps organize all the who's holding what and where and all that. I'm not going to go back and review all that because then we'll never get started with our daf. But we were up to this last very end, which I actually put into yesterday's chart, which is Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina had said that what does he do with the phrase lo talim pulat tzachir boker? Because the others learned something else from there, and he didn't agree with that. So what does he do with that? Right? They included sachar, bema, and kelim, right? And he didn't think that that was all part of it. So he used it for some other halacha that Rav Asi said. Now, Rav Asi said that even if you hired someone just to do a very small job to cut one cluster of grapes, still there's an issue of Baal Talim. So now the issue is, well, if the others didn't learn, right, the Tanakh, our mission, the Tanakh, the braita, didn't learn from that pasuk, this halacha of Rav Asi, where did they learn it from? And that's what we're up to right now. The idach, right? We finished that yesterday, but let's just go back to the very last line. This is going to lead into today's daf. Mi ve'elav hu nosei nafsho dafka. Because it said, let's just read the pasuk again, okay? The pasuk in Devarim, chapter 24, verse 15, reads like this. B'yomot titein scharo, pay on the day, v'lo tavo alav hashemesh, don't let the sun set, ki anihu, because he's poor, and here comes a more of a description, okay? Because he's poor, ve'elav hu nosei nafsho, and he basically risks his life for this, or he needs this for his life. We don't know exactly what this means, and that's exactly what's going to lead us to a bunch of different interpretations here. Okay, let's try to just translate literally. And to you, he puts his soul. Okay, and then it says, the end of that pasuk, below yikra lecha l'Hashem, we don't want him to call to God because he puts his soul to you, so he might call out to God. If you don't pay on time, vayabachachi, and then you'll have a sin on you. So what is this elavu nosei nafsho? To which the answer, that comes to teach Rav Asi, according to the Tanakh of the braita and the Mishnah. Well, it's anything that somebody risks their life for, meaning any kind of work they do, even to cut one cluster of grapes. And that means, right, that phrase is including that pasuk according to them. Okay, well, now let's ping pong back to Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina, top of our daf. V'idach, what's Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina going to do with that section of the verse? It seems totally unnecessary. You could have definitely ended the pasuk with, first of all, you could have just ended it, B'yomot titein scharo v'lo tavo alav hashemesh. Period. You didn't have to say because he's poor, that we already darshan. And you certainly didn't have to say, elav nosei nafsho. So what's Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina can learn for that? And in order to get to an answer, we're going to bring a braita with two different interpretations of that line. So he must need it for one of the interpretations of this braita. Elav nosei nafsho. Mipnei ma ala ze bekeresh v'nitla bi'ilan u'masar et atzmo lemita. Okay, as we all know, a worker who climbs on trees, who has to go up some ramp to get somewhere, it's dangerous, right? You could fall. How many people go up these ladders and fall down and have work accidents? And some could be fatal. This person is willing to work for you and risking his life or her life for it. Lo al scharo. Now, for what possible reason do people do jobs that are high-risk jobs, if not for money? That's why people work. They work to get paid. So therefore, right? This is basically just coming to tell you, why do you have to pay on time? Because these people are risking their lives in order to get paid. So of course you have to pay on time. That's one interpretation. The one that's going to interest us more, or that the Gemara is going to delve into more, is the second one. And either of these could potentially be what Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina darshans from. Davar acher, a different interpretation. It's very classic in a braita, and we're going to see this later because later they're going to darshan three things from one word, and they're not going to use this davar acher. But davar acher means or alternatively, because we generally have this principle, and I'm saying this because later today we're not going to use this principle. But generally we say you can't darshan two things from the same section or the same wording or the same, right? So anytime we do, we usually ask the question about it, but you can do this or that. So that's what this braita is setting up. A different interpretation. Kol akovesh sachar sachil ki'ilu notel nafsho mimenu. Here's going to be a big problem of pronouns, okay? And what's going to modify what? So if you're kovesh sachar sachir, if you don't pay your worker, it's as if you took his or her soul. Okay, now whose soul? Basically means as if you killed them. Now we assume as if you killed the person who you didn't pay. Well, Rav Huna Rav Chisda, Chan Amar Nafsho Shel Gazlan. Some people say you're taking your own soul. If you're the employer and you don't pay your worker, that's basically killing yourself, which we don't yet understand. Although, if you focus on what the end of that pasuk said, you'll understand why. Because the end of the pasuk said, if you don't pay them, they'll pray to God for you, and you'll have a sin. And perhaps we're going to see maybe that sin could lead you to death. Seems a little harsh, but we'll see where we have a source for that. More obvious is you're basically taking away the life because you're taking away their sustenance. You're not paying them on time. They can't buy food. That could cause their death. So Manda Amar Nafsho Shel Gazlan, now we're going to have to see where they get this from. And we're going to bring verses from Proverbs, from Mishlei, that are going to support each of these readings. Manda Amar Nafsho Shel Gazlan, that you're actually killing yourself, because even if you take the end of our verse, which again is a good support for this, because it says, right, he's no say it nafsho, which means basically you can cause your own death, because Vayikra will call out to God and you'll have a sin and then you get punished. Now, what kind of punishment? Well, it says in Mishlei, we're now in chapter 22 of Mishlei, Al tigzol dal kidalhu, don't steal from a poor because he's already poor, Va'al tidakani bashar, and don't put down the poor person in the gates. Uchtiv, and the next pasuk says, Ki Hashem yariv rivam, God will fight their fight. V'kava et kovehem nafesh. That means, or at least the way we're going to read it right now is, God will place the person who went against them. It's kind of a play on what God will do, like a midah keneged midah. Kava et kovehem. It's the same root. Those who put them down, God will put them down, nafesh, to the death. Okay, and there you see that by stealing from someone, it could actually cause your death. So therefore, elamu nosei nafsho means basically you could cause your own death if you push off pain. The support for the other one is a different pasuk in Mishlei, Proverbs, in the first chapter. Dichtiv, Kain orchot kol botzei batza et nefesh ba'alav yikach. This is the way of anyone who does betza, which is take advantage of someone financially. Et nefesh ba'alav yikach. He takes the soul of the person. Now, what's ba'alav? Well, the person who he's stealing from, he's taking their soul. Now, this you can identify with. There's certain people who get, right? There's one thing, someone steals from you, so you feel violated. Okay, that's one thing. But some people take it very personally and feel like, they say, right, you took 5 years off my life. And people say those kind of things. The aggravation, and people take it very personally, right? There's certain people who really get very offended by this kind of thing. And it's like taking their soul. So those are our two interpretations. What we're left to figure out is, how does each one interpret the other one's pasuk? Because each of these pasuk seems pretty clear. Stealing can cause the death of the person you steal from. And the other one says, stealing can cause your own death. So so how does the first interpretation, who said you're killing yourself, explain the pasuk about you're taking the soul of the owner? The owner, they assume, means the person who has the money, right, who you're stealing from. Right. In this case, it's not the person who has the money, it's the person who you didn't pay. But either which way, so what do they say? Ba'alav dehashta. It's the owner of the money now. So if you're stealing from someone, well, you're the owner of the money now because you stole it from them. And in our case, you're withholding the money, you're the owner of the money. So either which way, it could be understood as you're taking your own soul. And idach nami aktiva kavad kovehem nafesh. Now that one seems to say you steal from the poor, what will happen? God will punish you by death. So they read it, the pasuk, a little differently. Matam kamar. It's a matam. What is a matam? The end of the pasuk is explaining the earlier part of the pasuk, meaning, or here the end of the phrase, the nefesh, is explaining the first three words before that, the previous three words. How does it work? Matam kava et kovehem mishum denatlu nafesh. What it really means is, right? So again, it started with, don't steal from the poor and don't put them down because God will fight their fight. And kavad kovehem basically means put you in your place. Nafesh. Why nafesh? Because you took the nefesh of someone else, you will get put in your place. So it's explaining the reason why God will put you in your place, but not that God will punish you by death. It's not your death. God will punish you because it's as if you took their life. Okay, so basically what we did in this section was we took two interpretations that we could possibly suggest is Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina's way of reading the pasuk, ve'elav u'noseh nafsho, because he doesn't need it for the other drasha because he learned that other drasha from the other words in the pasuk. And therefore, what did we say? Either, pay the person because they risked their life for you by climbing on the tree or whatever they did that risked their life, or anyone who doesn't pay is as if they're taking away the life, either their own life or someone else's life, or the person who they're not paying, which is just trying to say how serious an issue this is. Take it very seriously. And we know why they're telling us to take it seriously, because this is something that is an everyday occurrence, and very often people don't take it seriously. Now we're going to get to all sorts of exceptions to the rule when lo talim does not apply. And as I mentioned before, we don't normally learn more than one thing from a word in a pasuk. Somehow in this next drasha, we're going to learn 3 exceptions to the rule from one word. And it's actually a word we darshan for something else yesterday. So all the more so, it raises questions, but the Gemara doesn't raise those questions, so we're not going to raise them either. But I'm just kind of mentioning it without having an answer. We now go back to get there, we go back to this line in the Mishnah. The Mishnah had said, Matai, when does this apply? Bisman shetva'o. Lo talin applies, don't delay paying salary, when the other side comes and says, I want my salary. But lo tva'o ain't no verala. But if they don't come and say, I want my salary, and presumably it means, they say, oh yeah, pay me whenever you want, or you come and say, listen, I don't want to pay today. Is it okay if I pay you next week? So that's the case. It's not a problem. So there is no isur. Okay, so Tanu Rabbanan, where do we learn this from? A braita. Lo tali, and because we're going to learn from the braita this exception, they're going to mention 2 other exceptions to the rule that they're going to learn from the same word. Lo talim pulat sachil. Yachol afilu lo tva'o. Well, it just says don't delay paying salary. You might have thought it meant even if they don't demand it from you. Talmud lomar itcha. What does it mean itcha? Right. Remember, it said lo talim pulat sachir. Okay, sachar sachir. This is in the pasuk in Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 13. Lo talim pu'ulat sachir itcha aboker. Don't delay paying your worker with you until the morning. What's this word with you? So we darshed it yesterday for something else. Now we're going to darshan it in 3 ways. With you means with your intent only. In other words, with your doing lida'atcha. You decided to push it off, not that the other side didn't want to push it off. You decide to push it off, that's when there's a lo ta'aseh, that's when you transgress the negative command. Yachol afilu ein lo. You might have thought, what if you don't have the money? And because of that, you don't pay. Is that a problem? In fact, it's not a problem. Talmud lomar itcha doesn't mean with you. Sheyesh itcha, a second drasha. The money has to be with you. If you don't have money to pay, then it's not a problem about talin. Okay, this raises all sorts of questions. What were you doing hiring a worker if you didn't have the money to pay? I'm putting that aside right now, but it seems to say, if you don't have the money in hand, right, the assumption is you'll get it in a few days, then it's not an issue. You might have thought, now remember we saw this yesterday, and we're going to get to this directly from the Mishnah in another second, which is, the Mishnah had listed this exception. If I go to a store owner, because I don't have the money, and I say, can you pay this person? Or I go to the money changer and I say, can you pay this person? Because they generally have cash on hand. Can you pay for me? And then they don't pay that day, it's not a problem. Talmud lomar, where do we get it from? Itcha. It's with you and not with somebody else, the responsibility. Okay, there's where our 3 exceptions. Again, I don't have an answer to the question. Why did the Gemara learn 3 different exceptions from one word? And in addition, we learned something else from it yesterday. Now we're up to that line in the Mishnah. Perfect, because we just finished with it. Now we have a question about this. Choser o eno choser. Let's say I hired you, and I told the store owner, to shopkeeper, to please pay you. And then the shopkeeper didn't pay you on time. So you come back to me. Do you have a right to demand salary from me? Or is it now in the hands of the storekeeper? So that's the question. They asked the following question: Choser o eno choser? Can you come back to me or not? Rav Sheshet Amar eno choser, the Raba Amar choser. Rav Sheshet says, no, you can't go back. I'm already free of responsibility, which is a crazy thing a little bit. I hired them. The person I asked to pay didn't pay, and now they have no recourse to go to me at all. But that's what Rav Sheshet says. Raba says choser. Raba says, no, of course they can go back to you and say, hey, I never got paid. Right? So there might not be any isur of lo talin, but still they can come back to me and demand payment, according to Raba. So now we're going to see where they each get it from. And it's not a most convincing answer because each is going to get it from the same place and just explain it in a different way. I'm a Raba, minah. So Raba says, where do I get this from? Midekatane eino over alav. Well, he gets it from the language in the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, eino over, right? You're not transgressing bal talin. So comes Raba and says, what does it mean you're not transgressing? It means ma'abrahu delo avar ham hadar hadar. He's going to infer and say the following: you're not going to transgress lo talin, but of course they can go back to you. In other words, there's no lo taseh of bal talin, but of course you're responsible. If it wanted to say you're not responsible at all, it would have worded it differently. You're done with responsibility here. Rav Sheshet says the exact opposite. My eino ovel, eino b'torat la'avol. Eino over means you're not even part of this issue of bal talin. You don't even have to pay anymore. You're not responsible. It's not your responsibility. You moved it on to somebody else. They become responsible, not you. Which again is a very hard opinion to really understand, but that's what he says. If you notice, I'll just point out, I didn't check the halacha l'maaseh, but the bet, there's a little bet next to Raba Amar Chozel, which usually means the majority of the commentaries held like Raba, which makes more sense because he has the more reasonable opinion. What do you mean? You accept the responsibility. The fact that you ask someone else to pay doesn't mean that you're scot-free and you don't have to pay anymore. Rav Sheshet. Now they asked Rav Sheshet the following question, and here Rav Sheshet is going to bring the only answer, and we're going to, obviously then that's going to be the answer. Kablanut over alav mishum bal talin or ein over alav mishum bal talin. Now, if we go back to the 6th chapter, we talked about the difference between an uman / kablan versus a socher. Socher is someone who works, a worker who works in your field, who works for the day, works for hours. Okay, they're a worker. You hire them for a job, but their job is to work per day. Whatever they do in that day, they do, or work for X number of hours. In uman or a kablan is someone, those are interchangeable words, synonyms. In uman or kablan is someone who you hire to do a particular job, and like it's called a contracted worker. And they finish the job. It's not like they have X number of days to finish the job. Whenever they finish the job, they finish the job. Okay, you're not hiring them and you're not paying them based on how many hours it takes them. You're paying them based on the work they're going to do. So for example, right, you bring your car into the garage to get fixed. You bring material to a seamstress to make a dress, or the dyer to dye your clothes, or all those kind of jobs, right? The dry cleaner. Okay, all those things, you bring them to do a job, and then they return to you a fixed product. So now the big debate is, if you don't pay them on time, is it bal talin or not? Are they considered your workers or not? Right? We don't normally consider those people your workers. On the other hand, you have to pay them for something, perhaps, right? And again, it's what it's going to break down to in a little bit of a more complicated fashion. I'm going to say it right now, but is it more like paying back a loan, where you owe them money for something and then it's basically like a loan? Or is it paying them like they were a worker? And you could see why it would go both ways. But they're going to show from a halachic, or from in halachic terminology, how it's what the two sides are. So here are the two sides. Uman koneh b'shevach kli v'halva'ahi. O ein uman koneh b'shevach kli u'schiruti. Let's explain what these words mean. We've learned this before, but what does it mean? Uman koneh b'shevach kli would mean, okay, we basically have this debate. Is an uman koneh b'shevach kli or not koneh b'shevach kli? Now, if we say one way or the other, that's going to affect whether we put it in the category of a loan or we put it in the category of a hired worker. Again, if it's a higher worker, then there's an issue of baltalin. If it's not a higher worker, then there isn't. So what is this uman koneh b'shavach kli? What it means is when I bring my car into the shop to get fixed, does it mean uman koneh b'shavach kli means they're going to return me a better car, right? My car is X right now. They're going to return to me X plus 2. It's going to be up in value because they fixed whatever was broken. And then I'm going to pay for that. So the question is it as if they own my car when I give it to them and they return to me something of higher value? And then I basically have to pay them for that item of higher value. It's as if when I come back, I'm paying them for the extra amount that they upped my car, right? My car was worth 100 and now it's worth 110. So I'm paying them for that 10 as if I just owe them money. And then it's like I have to pay a bill for something that someone did, right? But that is in the category of a loan because they actually, for a moment, became the owner of my car. And then when they give it back to me, I'm basically buying it back by paying for what they increased the value. Now, they're not really the owner, but it means that they're koneh b'shavach kli, what they up the value of the car, that is owned by them. Because that's something, right? A seamstress is a good example because she takes a material, turns it into a dress. That dress, in theory, is what she created, not your material, right? So is that shevach? Is that hers? Does she own it? And then she's just selling it back to you. And then it's more like a sale. And again, if you don't pay for the sale on time, well, then it's like a loan. You just owe them money. Or do you say, no, it's mine. They're just fixing it or making it better and giving it back to me. And I'm paying them for their labor, right? That's exactly the question. If I pay them for their labor, then they're a laborer, they're a worker. And then I would have an issue of baltalin. So let's see what Rav Sheshet says. He very simply answers, Amar lu Rav Sheshet, over. Yes, you are over on baltalin. We view them. You're just paying them as a worker. It's no different. So now they're going to bring, number one, a question against him, and then they'll answer it. And then they're going to bring an attempt to support Rav Sheshet, but also reject the support. And both times they're going to resolve the issue, either reject the support or resolve the difficulty by what we call an ukimta. What's an ukimta? Say, oh, don't worry, that source doesn't mean what you think it means because it's a unique situation. And then they'll explain which situation. So they say to Rav Sheshet, okay, you said that a kablan is over on baltalin, but hatanya ain't over. But there's a braita that says that in a kablan or uman is not over on baltalin. There is no negative prohibition for him or her. So to which they answer, hatem shilmcheu etzel chenvani ve'etzel shulchani. That source where it said a kablan is not over on baltalin, you could explain, again, they're not making it up, but they're basically saying, oh no, you could just say that source was referring to one of the cases where it was a kablan, but there was an exception to the rule because instead of paying the dry cleaners, I basically told the dry cleaners, listen, get the payment from the storekeeper next door. And that's why I wasn't over on baltalin, but not in a regular case, perhaps it would be, okay? And therefore that doesn't necessarily reject Rav Sheshet. And now here comes the attempt to prove. And how do I know they're going to reject it? Because it says, nema misayale. Nema misayale means, let us suggest, that's nema, let us say that misayale, that we have a support for Rav Sheshet, who's an emora, from a braita, right? So it's good if you could support your words from braita. But nema always means we're going to suggest something and then reject it. Nema and lema, both of those are words for we will, let us say. Hanotein talito le'uman. You give your talit to someone to fix. Gemara v'hodio, he finished it and told you, okay, the talit is ready. Afilu mikam ba'al asara yamim eino over mishum baltalin. They called you and told you it was finished, and you didn't pick it up. Even from here to 10 days, which sounds like even for the long term, as long as you don't pick up that talit, and this isn't the important part for our purposes, as long as you don't pick up that talit, there's no baltalin. However, and this is the key, Nitanalo b'chatzi hayom. They gave it to you midday. Misha shak'ala b'chama over mishum baltalin. If you don't pay them by the end of that day, by sunset, but already you're transgressing baltalin. Okay, this is pretty clear. You gave your talit. That sounds like an umam. We don't know what you gave your talit for, but you gave it to be cleaned, to be fixed, sewed. We don't know, but hemmed, whatever it could be. You gave it to an uman. They gave it back to you. And you didn't pay, there's baltalin. Okay, that seems very clear. That's Rav Sheshet. To which they say, right, if you want to say against Rav Sheshet, here's the way of proving it, that the person who gave the talit to acquired it and is now, and has acquired the shevach, whatever they increase the value, and therefore is selling that back to you. And therefore your payment is basically, you're buying it from them and it's just like a loan, amay ovil. Well, then there's no bal talin. So it must be Rav, that this is a support for Rav Sheshet. To which I told you already before, we're going to do an ukimta and say, no, maybe this is in a unique case. Now, I specifically said we weren't sure what you were doing with this talit. Because of that, we're now going to suggest that perhaps what the umam is doing with the talit was something that would be an exception to the rule. It's a little bit strange at first, but then we'll correct it. Amar Rav Meri Bered Rav Kahana. So Rav Meri, the son of Rav Kahana, suggests an ukimta bigrada disarbala. Maybe it's this cloak that you have, or a piece of clothing, that they were cleaning, and when they clean that kind of clothing, they kind of soften it, that does the cleaning process, but it ruins the material. So there's no shevach. In other words, if we're going to say uman koneh b'shevach, it has to be that they increase the value. Now here, while you increase the value by cleaning it, you decreased it because it's wear and tear on the clothes. So in the end, it didn't really go up at all. To which the Gemara says, wait a minute. If you're not improving the clothing at all, what did you give it to the person for? If it's going to come back worse than it was, then you would never bring it to them. What did you bring it for? To soften. Hainu shvache. You would have to count that, even though by softening it, maybe you also ruined the material a little bit, but still you obviously prefer to have a clean cloth that's maybe a little bit depreciated in value, but it's because you want to have it clean. So for you, that's a benefit, and that's what you're paying for. So for sure, there's a benefit here. You can't say there is no benefit, and then it would be a unique circumstance. To which they answer, fine. So we'll give a different explanation. It is garda disarbala, but lo tzricha deka agre mine lebatushe bitcha ubitcha bemata. We've learned this before, that you've hired the person. Not, okay, if I take something to a laundromat, I hire them to clean it. I don't pay for how many times they're going to put it in the washing machine or how many times they're going to dry clean it, right? Put it through a process. But in this case, you hired the person, what they would do is they would beat it in order to get it to be clean. It was a process of cleaning. And you pay them by every beat. Okay, every time they hit it, you would pay per hit. So basically, that would mean it's a hired worker. This isn't a contracted worker, because you're paying in this way per action of the person. That's more like a sachir. And that way, this is not talking about an uman. So if you gave your talit to someone, it's a little weird because it says anotein talit to the uman, but they're basically saying in this case, you gave it to an uman, but you paid per, okay, what it means, the wording is, right, lebatushe bitcha, that's to hit it, and bitcha b'mata, every bitush, that's the action you would do, costs a me'ah, which is an amount of money, small amount of money, but you pay per thing, and that puts it in a different category of the sachir, and that's why there's bal talit. But it doesn't teach you anything about is Rav Sheshet right. So we brought Rav Sheshet's opinion about this. We basically said there's, perhaps something that contradicts, but we resolved it, perhaps something to support, but that is rejected. Now we're moving to Amud Bet, and Amud Bet is all one topic, a very interesting topic. Hopefully, God willing, today, Gefet will go up with Rabbanit El Shimoni's Shiur on this. If not today, then tomorrow. By the way, just went up, I think, yesterday, last week's Shiur about Heter Iska. So this is a little delay in the English, but Heter Iska went up. I know Alana Steinhain and Din and Daf talked about it when we were back in the 5th chapter. Now we're going to have a bit of a different perspective from Gefet. It's fun to always learn things in 2 different perspectives, and a very, very relevant topic of Heter Iska. And that's because it came up again on Daf Kuf Dalid. About how it works, how we deal with this whole interest issue. So that's number 1, Gefet to listen to. And additionally, today they'll be on this topic, which is a super interesting topic. And there's a Tosfot, which really struggles with the logic going on here and raises some questions. And Rabbanit El Shimoni is going to get into them. Okay, and perhaps suggest some answers that even Tosfot didn't have answers, which is interesting in and of itself. So now we go back to the Mishnah. And the Mishnah had said, the Mishnah ended with this issue of, was the very end. No, it wasn't the end of the Mishnah. It was the middle section of the Mishnah ended with this. Sachir bizmano nishba v'notel, avar zmano ino nishba v'notel. So we had this issue of, there's a date where someone's supposed to get paid. if there's a debate about whether the person got paid before the date, then the person who's supposed to get paid takes an oath and gets their money and says, I never got paid. I swear I never got paid, and can get the money. If it's beyond the time, like the salary date passed, we assume that the employer paid, and therefore the worker doesn't get to take the oath. What happens? The employer takes the oath and doesn't have to pay. Now, that's avar zmano eino nishba. The truth is, it just says eino nishba v'no tel. Okay, he can't take the oath to get paid. Now, it seems like the reason is because there's an assumption that people don't pay their workers before the date, and after the date they do. But we're really going to learn that the reason why they institute this oath is really for a different reason. Okay, and now we have this big problem, really, because even if we were worried that maybe, right, if it's before the date, we don't think the owner really paid, if we're unsure, because we assume, right, the owner probably didn't pay, because who pays their workers before payday? But still, the typical, when we have a doubt about something like this, the Torah law is we basically let the person who wants, okay, we have this concept, if you remember, the burden of proof is on the person who's trying to get the money out. And oaths work in the same way, that we basically use the oaths to maintain status quo. So what we should have is, since the employer didn't pay yet, but there's a debate, we don't know, maybe the employer did pay. So if the employer claims I already paid, what normally should happen is the employer should take an oath, I already paid, and then be exempt from paying. So why do we let the worker take the oath and get the money out of the employer? That's usually not the way we go with oaths. We don't usually have a shvuat nishba v'notel. The typical, right, shvuat nishba v'notel means take an oath and collect. The typical oath, and we'll get into this a lot more when we get to Masechet Shvuot and a few more Masechtot, the general rule is nishba ve'eno meshalem. When there's Torah oaths or even rabbinic oaths, because rabbinic oaths are set up to be like Torah oaths, and here we have a rabbinic oath, which is you take an oath and then you just leave the money where it is. So that's going to be the Gemara's basic question. Sachir b'zmano nishba v'notel. Sachir amaytakinu le'Rabbanan le'mishtaba b'shakil. Why did the rabbis institute that the worker can basically take the oath and get paid? And we're going to have a lot of redos here or fixing up and things like that. First, with just this intro sentence, we're going to have some struggles with. I'm a Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel. So before we even get into the sugya, we're going to have like a topic sentence about this topic. Halachot gedolot shanu kan. Great halachot were taught here. That's a bit of a strange statement that Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, in which the Gemara says, Hani hilchetaninu, hainu takanot. The way Rashi understands this question, we say halacha, we don't mean the way we use the term halacha nowadays. Halacha usually means halacha l'Moshe Sinai, which means it was a very old tradition. Usually it's something that there's no machloket about, nobody disagrees about, and it often means we don't even know the reason for it. And that's really what they're struggling with, because they're saying this is not a halacha l'Moshe Sinai that dated way back when, and basically is, we don't even really know the reason. This is a takana that the rabbis instituted with a reason, with an explanation. So you can't call this halacha gedola. So fine, Ela Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, they fix what Rav Yehuda must have said in the name of Shmuel, takanot gedolot shanukan. So we changed one word. Okay, it wasn't halachot gedolot, it was takanot gedolot. This was a big takana the rabbis instituted. So now the Gemara doesn't like that either. Gedolot, michal deika ktanot. Wait, great takana? That seems to imply there's also small takanot. Oh, what are you talking about here? Ela Amar Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel. So now they can't change Rav Yehuda too much from what he originally said. So they say, fine, we'll bring Rav Nachman who quoted Shmuel, because that was Rav Yehuda quoting Shmuel. He quoted Shmuel differently. And that makes more sense. Takanot kvuot shanukan. This is a takanat kvu'ah. Okay, what does that mean? Rashi says, okay, kvu'ah means set. Ra'oi la'asotan keva la'akor aleihem davar min haTorah. This is saying is this should become super established. Why do they have to say that? Because it's basically overriding something the Torah says. Okay, let's just read the whole thing in Rashi. Dichtiv, it says in Sefer Shmo, when it's in Shmo Kafbet, v'lakach ba'ala v'lo yishalem. This is the source that they get to. Lakach ba'ala, he takes an oath and doesn't pay. That's the classic oath in the Torah. We're going to see that in the Gemara in a second. But the Gemara is going to say it explicitly. Okay, let's just read in the Gemara. I'm back in the Gemara. Okay, so again, oh, sorry, I skipped a few words. So again, takanot kvuot shanukan. This is a big change, I guess, is what they're saying, and it should become institutionalized. Shvua de balabayit. The shvua normally should be on the employer, and because lakach ba'alav v'lo yishalem, in order to get out of payment, we allow an oath. Rabbanan the shvua de balabayit v'shadua asachir. And the rabbis uprooted the shvua and said, no. We move it from the balabayit and we put it on the other side. Again, we've learned this before, that there's sometimes when someone's not believed, when someone's this. We actually talked about this specific issue before, but today we're going to have a long-winded way to get to where we got to last time we talked about it. So the rabbis basically put it on the sachir. And now the big question is why? And here they continue, and the line is that Rabbi Yosef and Rav Shmuel, mishum kedei chayav de sachir. Because of the livelihood of the worker, right? The worker's working for a living, needs to make money. If we allow, right, big capitalist, right, this is basically going for strong labor laws. If we allow rich people to take advantage, these people will have no livelihood. So then they say, who's to say everyone who hires workers is rich? Mishum kedei chayav de sachir. We're going to have a lot of long-winded circular reasoning and say, well, or maybe not circular, but this doesn't really work. Okay, we're going to reject every suggestion we have and look at it on the flip side. Mishum kedei chayav de sachir mifsedna lebalabayit. So they say, wait a minute, just because we're worried about the livelihood of the worker, so we're going to make the owner lose out on their money? First of all, the owner might also be not so rich. And even if they're rich, what? They hired someone. This person could potentially take advantage and lie under oath and say, I never got paid and get double pay. It doesn't seem fair to take the oath that should have been on the owner because we're worried about the livelihood of the sachir. Well, we should worry about the livelihood. If the workers are going to have to double pay everybody, they'll have the employers, they're going to have no money left also. So this is the classic, okay, it's nice to support the labor unions, but what about the employers? Balabayit, gufe. Now we get to an ethical or a moral kind of, or a more big picture concern. If we institute that workers aren't protected, what will happen? Well, balabayit gufe nichale demishta basachir v'shakil. It's in the employer's best interest to basically allow the worker to take an oath to get their money because it protects the worker's rights. Now, why is protecting the worker's rights in the interest of the employer? Because otherwise there won't be workers. Now, if you have a big farm, you can't work the farm by yourself, right? The fields, let's say. It's not a job you can do alone. You need workers. If you don't have workers, if your workers' rights aren't protected, nobody will want to work. So therefore, it's in the best interest for this takana. The owner / employer is willing to move the shvuah onto the other side in the off chance that the person might lie falsely and take extra money from them, because overall it's in their best interest to have workers happy and willing to work. Otherwise, they'll be stuck. To which the Gemara says, what do you mean? You could put this logic the other way. Sachir gufe nichale demishta balabayit v'yivka ki echa diligru. What do you mean? Workers are desperate for work. If the employer's rights aren't protected, right? This is a great debate. If the employer's rights aren't protected, they just won't hire people, because if people are going to take advantage and lie under oath, right? They're not going to hire anybody. And if they don't hire anybody, these poor people are going to be out of work and have nothing to do and have nothing to eat. So it's in the workers, just like you could say it's in the employer's best interest to give the other side rights, it's in the workers' best interest to have the employers have rights and be able to take their oath. So back to square one. So they say, Balabayit al korche agar. Balabayit has no choice. They have to hire workers. They can't do the work alone. To which they say, Sachir nami bal korche idgar. What do you mean? The workers also have no choice. They have to work. Otherwise, they'll have no livelihood. So we keep going around in circles, getting nowhere. We still don't really know why. Ella, we're now going to explain what the real reason is. Balabayit talu b'poalim. The balabayit is busy with his workers or her workers and can't keep track of who they paid, who they didn't pay. They might get confused. We can't let them take an oath because they might take a false oath by accident, thinking they're taking a real oath, thinking that they didn't pay the work, thinking that they paid the worker, and really they didn't pay the worker. And now, according to this, it sounds like, okay, the wording here, terubit po'alav, Rashi said, right? The employer thinks that she paid her workers, but she didn't really. Now, this is because it seems like, from the wording here, but po'alim, we have a lot of workers. What if you only have one worker? If you only have one worker, it seems like we don't think this would be relevant. However, the Yerushalmi has a different language. In the Yerushalmi, it's that the employer is busy with their work, distracted by their work. In other words, think about it. Even if you have one worker, right, you're responsible for the whole operation. So you're very focused on the whole thing. You don't have time to focus on every little detail. You might get confused because you're focused, you have more responsibility. The worker just comes to work, 9 to 5 job, goes to work, leaves, doesn't have pressures on their heads, right? So it's one of the good things about being a simple worker because you don't have the responsibility. Whereas the person who hires you has a lot of responsibility on their head. They have the whole business on their head, even if it's just one worker. So according to the Yerushalmi, this would be relevant even for only one worker, because the issue is, it's just that you have the responsibility on your head, right? This reminds me, my son is an officer in Miluim, and he was telling me, his friends seem to have more time, even though they were in the army right now in Miluim. He said, yeah, because they're just soldiers. I'm the officer. I have a lot more responsibility. So it's that same idea that you don't have time to be free to be thinking about anything else when you're in charge, when you're just doing your job, and when it's over, you could just do your own thing. So now, ihachi, now they say, if so, okay, that still doesn't resolve everything, because if we're going to say that we don't trust the balabayit at all, and we trust the worker, well, then natively below shvua, then you should be able to do it without even taking an oath. In other words, if we assume that the worker knows whether they got paid or not, and again, remember, this is before the time they were anyway supposed to get paid, and we don't trust the balabayit when the balabayit says, oh, I already paid, because anyway, it was before it was before the day they were supposed to pay, and we just assume you're busy, distracted, then they should be able to get it without an oath. To which they answer, again, you have to keep looking at both sides. Well, we do have a situation here where the balabayit thinks that the balabayit actually paid. So in order to appease them, right, it's not a good situation when you think you paid your worker and your worker says you didn't, and then they just take the money from you. So they institute the oath to make the balabayit feel better, okay? So that once the other person took an oath, then they say, oh, I guess maybe you're really right. Because again, people were scared of oaths. They didn't like to take oaths falsely. More questions. Why don't we just resolve this problem from the get-go? And now we're going to suggest some possible suggestions, like natively be'edim. In order to avoid this problem from happening, that the worker says, again, we're still trying to protect the employer's rights, even though we gave the worker more leverage here. Why don't we just say, pay your workers with witnesses all the time, and then you'll avoid this problem? No, that's too much of a tircha. That's a bother. Every time you're going to pay your workers, you have to bring witnesses. That's really difficult. Why don't you pay up front? That's a good idea. And then what? How does that resolve your problem? Well, if your worker comes in the morning and they get paid first thing in the morning and then they do the work, if they claim later that you never paid them, and you could say, well, then why'd you do the job? If everybody takes money before they work, it was your fault for starting to work. I paid you and you claim no, but right, I'll be right as the employer. So why don't we just do that? And the answer, and I'll tell you, it's an interesting answer because there's all different interpretations why this is, Shneim rotzim ba'akafa. Both sides prefer that they pay at the end of the day. Why is that? So, good question. Rashi says, balabayit pa'amim she'en lo. So the employer, that's easy. They don't always have the money in hand. Hoel shemi yaplu mimenu. The worker is worried if I get the money in the morning and I'm working in the fields all day, maybe it'll fall from my pocket. I want to get the money at the end of the day, so I'm sure to go home with it. Rashi in Shvuah gives a different reason, because this sugya comes up in Shvuah and Daf Mem. He says there that maybe he'll spend his money during the day on silly things, like getting a Coke on the job and all that. If he doesn't have money in his pocket, he won't go buy silly things, and he'll end up at the end of the day with actual money. Some people explain the balabayit could have a different reason, which I think is the more obvious reason, which is you never want to pay up front, right? You hire a worker to come to your house to do something, you want to wait to make sure they do the job, right? We learned already in a socher ta'umim that people could just renege in the middle of the day. So you don't want to pay up front. Maybe they'll leave in the middle of the day and then you can have a hard time getting your money back. You don't want to be in that situation. Okay, 2 more questions here. If the whole thing is that we allow the worker to pay, then what about this other situation where we don't allow we allow the worker to take an oath and get paid? What about this situation where we don't? Here's another disagreement between a worker and the employer. Okay, what's katsatz? If we set a price and there's an argument about the price. Alama Tanya, now there we would assume also, if there's an argument about price, we'll say the same thing. The owner doesn't remember because he's busy with, he or she is busy with their workers, but the worker knows what they were promised to get paid. But it's not what we say here. Alama Tanya, why does it then say in a braita? We have a debate. Was it one or two? Okay, the uman says you promised me two, and the other person says only one. Well, if the worker wants to get paid two, they have to prove it. So why is it different there? Because people remember what they agreed to pay people. That's something we don't. Okay, here's where you get into, again, I always love these sugyot. It's all about what the expectations of human behavior are, which we know, could be very different from this. We make these general rules. I always compare it to economics, where they make all these general rules about how we assume people will act, even though everybody acts differently. What some people remember, what other people remember. Here we're just making general rules, and based on those general assumptions about what we assume human behavior, we make rules based on that. And last question, well, what about once it's past the date? If we say that the worker doesn't, okay, I'm sorry to do this to you, but at the end of today's stuff, we're going to basically raise a huge question about what we've been learning, and this really throws everything in doubt, which is, remember, the whole thing is, we assume the Baal Bayit doesn't remember. So well then, even if it's past the date, we assume the employer doesn't remember. And why does it say alamatnan, avar zmano eno nishpa b'notel? If the debate ensues after payday, then we assume that the owner, the employer, is in the right. And basically, the worker can't take an oath and get paid. That's because we assume that the employer is going to make sure not to delay paying salary because of the mitzvah lo taseh in the Torah. So they say, what do you mean? Didn't you say they're confused, they don't remember whether they pay people or not? Now you're all of a sudden you're saying, but on payday they'll remember? It's a very strange answer. This basically says before payday, they might get confused. But when payday arrives, they'll remember who they paid and who they didn't. And then that's why we believe them after payday, because we assume they didn't push off paying the salary. Some of the commentaries say, and this is why it raises a huge question, well, then why don't we just say if they're having this argument, let's say 5 days before payday, just wait till payday. We assume at payday they'll remember, right? It's a big question, this sugya. Something really doesn't jive here. So anyway, I'm leaving it as a question right now. But we will continue with the sugya tomorrow, but it seems like this is where they leave it. They make this distinction, even though it really isn't so clear cut. Okay, quick review. So we started with a lavu nosei nafsho, some different interpretations. Then we went to these exceptions to the rule where there is no Baal Talin. We talked about if you give it to the chembani, then are you no longer responsible or are you still responsible? There was a debate. Is there Baal Talin for kablanut? Rav Sheshet said yes. Tried to bring support and rejection for his opinion. Both were rejected, both sources. Then we talked about this big issue of how we took this oath that should have been on the employer and we put it onto the employee and allows the employee to take an oath and get paid when there's a disagreement, only though before payday. If it's after the day that we're supposed to get paid, then already we side with the owner. And that we explained what the difference is, even though it leaves still a big question looming that is not so clear there, how we make that distinction. With that, we'll finish for today. A very interesting, relevant daf, and we'll meet up tomorrow. And don't forget to register for next week's siyum. And by the way, there's siyums going on in Israel in some locations, so you can check on the Hebrew site if you want to join one of the local siyums going on.